During the 1920s, as the economy was booming and culture wars were dividing the nation, in terms of politics, Americans just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to pursue their own interest. They wanted to, focus on whatever their obsession was, whether that's bootlegging or religion, black nationalism, white nationalism, whatever. Everyone just wanted to be left alone, especially just to pursue wealth without inhibition. And so during the decade, the government very intentionally not just stepped aside to let business take over, but the government will actively work to promote the interest of business. The idea of welfare capitalism is if the government or if businesses are given complete control, that is what's best for the welfare of the entire population. So, during the decade, I've mentioned this before, throughout the second half of U.S. history, the parties changed drastically, and sometimes you'll hear people say they just switched. That is not accurate. They changed drastically, but they don't just switch places, because one consistent theme is, since its inception, the Republican Party had been more the party of business, especially with the rise of corporations. They're associated with big business, and that is something that is fairly consistent. So it makes sense that the Republican Party will dominate politics in the 1920s. Now, Americans did not want any sort of crusader like Teddy Roosevelt. They didn't want any progressive. They wanted to be left alone. And so during the decade, we got some fairly unimpressive presidents. Warren G. Harding being one of the most unimpressive presidents in U.S. history. He didn't give a whole lot of quotes. This is one of his more famous ones that really captures the mood of the decade in terms of politics. What this country needs is less government in business and more business in government. That is still a very popular idea that you hear quite a lot. Harding, when he was elected, he was from Ohio. He was born on a son of a farmer. He ended up marrying a very wealthy woman who bought him a newspaper, and he used that newspaper to promote Republican policies and Republican causes. That is how he got so heavily into the Republican Party and was seen as like a spokesperson for the party. He presented himself as, just a son of farmers, very simple, very pious, good old boy, just a plain fellow, old-fashioned, and even reactionary in matters of faith and morals. He made it sound like he had like puritanical values, and he was not at all like that. He chewed tobacco, he drank a lot, he gambled at least once a week with his friends at they had a special cabin they would go to, and he womanized like crazy. He did that before he became president, and after he became president, it definitely did not slow down. He continued all those things, and he had no business being president. And the funny thing is, even he knew that. Even he, as president, knew that. And it's funny, all of his friends did too. So his friends would say stuff like, "My God, Harding as president of the United States." But he even referenced it. "I cannot hope to be one of the great presidents, but perhaps I may be remembered as one of the best loved. I don't think I'm big enough for the presidency." So he knew he was not fit for the office, and he was not fit for the office. Because he was a good old boy and a party stalwart, he brought they're called the Ohio Gang. It was Republicans from Ohio especially. He brought them into office with him. He brought his friends with him, and they caused him no end of trouble. His friends used the White House to enrich themselves. Now, Harding himself did not, to his credit, he did not use the government to make himself richer, or his time in office to be richer, but all of his friends did, and he was so loyal to them that he let them get away with it. And there were so many examples of corruptions, that there's so many examples of it that you can't even go to all of it. The head of the Veterans Bureau, he would sell hospital supplies, and then when he was caught, he fled to Europe. His general counsel and the lawyer for the Veterans Bureau committed suicide because he knew he was caught. The Attorney General of the United States, Henry Dougherty, he was selling pardons to people. And the most famous, though, the biggest scandal was his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. Secretary of the Interior is in charge of all government land. And Fall, people started noticing that, hey, all of a sudden he had a new ranch in Colorado with all like 50 heads of cattle, and he had all sorts of, he just became rich in a very short period of time, and everyone wondered what's going on. Well, it turns out he sold government land, or he was bribed for government land that had oil under it. It's called the Teapot Dome scandal, and it was the biggest, but it was not the only scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal, it will lead to Fall becoming the first cabinet member in U.S. history that is sent directly to jail. So there was corruption all over, and Harding, he had up to that point the most corrupt administration in all of U.S. history, and that is including the Grant administration. One of my favorite quotes, "My God, this is a hell of a job. I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies, all right. But my damn friends, my GD friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights." So he was having a hell of a time as president. Then in 1923, he went on a trip out west, and when he was in Alaska, he got sick. And he came back to Seattle, he got more sick, and he will die in a hospital in San Francisco. Now, when he passed away, there was a huge outpouring of grief and sadness for Harding. But then, over the next few years, all of his scandals came out, and there were just so many of them, especially his sexual scandals, like fathered a child with illegitimate child with a woman named Nan Britton. They had many sexual encounters in the White House, and that wasn't the only one, though. He also, they found love letters he wrote to, it was a senator's wife. They wrote back and forth, and they're just the most cringy things. If you want to be horrified, just go ahead and Google his romantic letters. They're just horrifying. So this brought Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. Now, you would think that with all these scandals, all of this corruption, you would think it would hurt the Republican Party. But it didn't. Americans did not care. And when I say they didn't care, I mean the vast majority of Americans, they weren't angry at the corruption. They weren't angry at the Republican Party. What they were angry at were the journalists that were reporting on it. It's very similar to today. People don't blame whatever the problem is, they blame the people that are presenting the problem, the journalists that are talking about the investigations and saying what's happening. Americans had no interest. They just did not care. They wanted to be left alone. So how much it did not affect the Republicans was demonstrated in the election of 1924. Republicans nominated Calvin Coolidge because he was already the president, and the Democrats will nominate a guy named John W. Davis. Now, this is the first and last time you will hear his name. And how insane the Democrats were, they had to vote 103 times, or call roll 103 times at their convention before they could pick Davis. I told you there are some themes that there are some consistencies with the parties, and the Democratic Party, something that's very consistent is they've always just been terrible at politics, with some very minor exceptions, but in general, the Democratic Party, and I'm not criticizing any specific candidate or any specific policy, but as a party, they are just so bad at politics. They manage to pick the wrong candidate all the time. There's a comedian named Will Rogers at the time made a very famous statement. He said, "I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." That's a very good summary of the history of the Democratic Party. Now, there were some people in the country that could not stand this, that were so disgusted by the candidates that they rallied around Robert Lafayette, and he will run as the progressive candidate. So there are still progressives in the country. Democrats, they were so delusional, they actually thought, well, with the Progressive Party, he'll divide the Republicans. And no, he did not. It was just a complete one-sided all-out victory, and it was overwhelming. Coolidge won 54% of the popular vote. Davis won 29% of the popular vote. So it was just completely overwhelming in Republican victory, which tells you Americans truly did not care about the corruption and the scandal. A little bit about Calvin Coolidge. You will not be tested on any of this, but his nickname was Silent Cal. He is one of the quietest presidents we've ever had in U.S. history. He said as little as he possibly could, and he did as little as he possibly could. He very famously said, "You will never be judged for something you don't say," so he just didn't talk. There's a famous story about he was at a party as president of the United States, and he's sitting next to a woman, and she's just talking, and he just keeps looking over at her, nodding, doesn't say a word. After an hour and a half, the woman says, "President Coolidge, my husband bet me that I could not get you to say 3 words. And I've been talking for an hour and a half, and so far you have not said 3 words to me. What do you have to say about the fact that you are going to make me lose this bet?" Coolidge smiled and said, "He wins." He had a sense of humor, at least. And if you think I'm being overly critical, he slept between 10 and 12 hours a night. And he took a 2-hour nap every day. This is the President of the United States. We now know he actually was probably suffering from depression because he had a child die before he was in office. But he actually had been like this beforehand, too. It's just, as president, it's a little more surprising for anyone to sleep that long. He also said, 9 times out of 10, I've found if you just ignore a problem, it'll go away. That is the President of the United States saying, yeah, just ignore problems. He would actually get bored in the White House. He'd be sitting there in the Oval Office like, what am I supposed to do? I've got nothing to do. And there are several occasions where he would, he has the buttons to call like Secret Service, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury, and his secretary and all that stuff. And he would be so bored, he would just pound all the buttons, call everyone, and then hide under his desk or hide behind a curtain. And then the White House would explode. Everyone's running around. Were you called by the president? I was too. Where's Coolidge? There, and he would just find that hilarious. It is the President of the United States. When he died, when he passed away, Will Rogers, I think it was, Will Rogers said, so apparently President Coolidge has passed away. I'm just wondering, how can they tell? And yeah, at the time, this isn't the historian's interpretation, at the time people understood that. He just did very, very little. But as a party, the Republican Party did a lot to promote business. And they did this in all sorts of ways. One of the most important ways the government promoted business was through the Secretary of Commerce, a guy named Herbert Hoover. You know, you've heard his name. He's a future president. Hoover, it was incredibly fascinating. He is the best example of the government promoting business and industry. So again, the government's not stepping back and letting business take over. It is actively helping to make business run better, more efficient, and give it more power. He was an orphan, and he worked his way up to be top of his class at Stanford, and then made a fortune in mining. So he is legitimately a self-made millionaire. And he will be Secretary of Commerce, which, you know, commerce that's business, basically, throughout the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And more than anyone else, people saw him as the person most responsible for the prosperity of the 1920s. The Commerce Department, it was a fairly unimportant department before he took over, and he will do all sorts of things to promote business. One of the most important that he did was help in the formation of trade associations. So he saw competition as actually wasteful. So he will bring together all business leaders in certain industries. So he brought all the steel businesses together, brought all the oil business together, and they will have thousands and thousands of meetings. And what he does with these trade associations is get them to coordinate, to talk about what they're paying their workers, how much their sales are, their purchases, all their prices. So basically they can share information so they can decrease competition. Now, what would you think this would lead to? The whole idea behind it is with less competition, it'll decrease prices for consumers. And as you would guess, what it actually led to was the formation of monopolies. Under his leadership, there will be more than 6,000 business mergers. And so 1,200 companies ended up combining until 200 companies will control about 50% of the entire U.S. economy. So they are actively promoting monopolies because it's supposed to be good for everyone. So he is the best example, and he will get the most credit for the great economy. Another person that will be absolutely instrumental is Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury. He is the second longest running Secretary of the Treasury, because he will dictate economic policy, a lot of economic policy throughout the 20s. And what his overriding objective was to reduce taxes. And not just reduce taxes, but reduce taxes on the wealthy. So he will, under his leadership, taxes will be insanely reduced. And when I say insanely reduced, I mean for the richest Americans, taxes were cut by more than 2/3 throughout his tenure. And he specifically cut taxes for the wealthy. And what he argued was, if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they will be able to invest, and then that investment will increase the general welfare. If that sounds familiar, it's called trickle-down economics. Most people think it's something Reagan invented, because it'll be a big part of Ronald Reagan's policy, but it is not. It started with Andrew Mellon. So there was a massive decrease in taxes for the wealthy. Besides that, the government will also pass one of the highest tariffs in U.S. history. So tariffs had been lowered under Wilson's presidency. During the 1920s, tariffs will be greatly increased. The Ford-Macomber tariff is one of the highest tariff increases in all of U.S. history. And It covered just about everything. So it is Americans trying to protect American businesses and American, it even applied to agriculture, which hadn't been true for some other tariffs. So it's basically trying to protect all American businesses. Another thing they did was deregulate. Now, it is very difficult to destroy a regulatory agency. And especially had Coolidge been able to, Coolidge would have definitely gotten rid of like the ICC, but that's difficult. It's difficult to completely destroy it. So in terms of regulatory agencies, people have this weird belief that like, oh, well, this regulatory agency exists, like the Security Exchange Commission regulates the stock market, which that is going to solve the problems, but it totally depends on who is in charge. If you want to make a regulatory agency completely worthless, you just put someone in charge of it that does not believe in regulating. That's what happened with the ICC when it was first created, and they put people that worked for the railroad company in charge of it. And that's what happens during the 1920s. Under Harding and Coolidge, individuals will be appointed to Interstate Commerce Commission, the Security Exchange Commission, Federal Reserve, which regulates all banks, all those regulatory agencies, someone's put in charge of it that did not believe in regulating. So basically they just step back and let business do whatever it wanted. And so because of this deregulatory instinct, the United States during the 1920s, we will also, this is when those laws passed during Wilson's presidency, like to prohibit child labor and provide a minimum wage for women, those are struck down. Those are gotten rid of. And these deregulation, obviously, businesses love it, and it will have several long-term negative effects. One of the big ones is it will lead to a massive amount of speculation on the stock market. So keep that in mind for the next lecture. Now, if everything's given over to business, then obviously, what is the institution that businesses are most against? Labor unions. And labor unions did absolutely terrible during the 1920s. In the 1920s, they will do incredibly bad, and it's because of the adoption of what's called the American Plan. The American Plan, it is now what's called open shop. The idea behind it is giving the workers the right to join unions and not forcing them. But in practice, what the American Plan and open door policy really means is discriminating against workers that join unions and against organized labor in general. So it's presented as it's giving workers a choice, but in reality, in practice, the way it works is businesses a lot of them refuse to even recognize unions. So a lot of businesses will adopt the American Plan and even what are called yellow dog contracts. That is a contract a worker must sign before they join a company, guaranteeing they will not join a union. And if they go against that, then they can be fired. So terrible decade for labor. The number of Americans that were part of labor unions will drop from somewhere about 5 million in 1920 to around a little over 3 million. So almost 2 million people leave unions because of the American Plan and yellow dog contracts. So business was given all power. And it is not an exaggeration to say during the 1920s, business became almost a religion. And that is not an exaggeration. Business became the source of the solution for all problems. Coolidge said it very well. The chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. And nothing demonstrates how dominant this idea was than one of the most popular books of the decade. You can tell the mood of the country by what literature is popular. So like in the Progressive era, it was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. During the 1920s, one of the most popular books was The Man Nobody Knows by Bruce Barton. And it was a novel take on the story of Jesus because it didn't present Jesus as a very pious, religious, and spiritual person. It presented him as a salesman. He said, according to Barton, Jesus was the world's greatest business executive, and he was, in effect, a traveling salesman. And this will be an incredibly popular view, and the book just is a smash hit. Jesus is the founder of modern business, the world's greatest business executive. Every advertising man ought to study the parables of Jesus. So it was combining religion and business, but making Jesus into a businessman. So that gives you an idea of how dominant business was, and how Americans really genuinely saw it as the solution to all problems. And throughout a lot of the decade, it was effective. Throughout a lot of the decade, if you asked most Americans, how exactly is the country doing, most Americans would say it's doing phenomenal. It is doing absolutely phenomenal, and nothing needs to change. We need to just give business control of absolutely everything, and if we do that, then it'll solve all problems. So Americans stop turning to their workplaces. They stop turning to the government, and they stopped looking at unions as the answer, and they started looking to business. Now, what is the measure of welfare capitalism, and if it's working? How is everyone doing? Throughout most of the 1920s, the majority of the population would say, well, we're all doing fantastic, so welfare capitalism is working. So throughout a lot of the decade, most people would say it's going fantastic. Now, there is a big problem with welfare capitalism. There were a lot of businesses that, like Henry Ford, that increased the pay of workers and treated them very well. But there is a problem. How long will that last? And we see it today with the tech giants, working for Google, working for Microsoft, working for Meta, and all those companies. They had great benefits until the companies decided that they needed to cut those. Welfare capitalism, it works until it doesn't work, and when it stops working is when businesses decide they're not going to continue to support it. They're not going to continue the benefits. And so it is completely contingent on companies, and those companies thinking it's in their economic interest. But if at any point those businesses decide it is not in our economic interest, then they will just cut all the benefits, fire the employees, cut their employees' pay. That is what we are seeing today with the tech giants, and obviously that is what will happen at the end of the 1920s. To put this all in a much bigger picture, though, during the 1920s, America will become not just individualistic, but hyper-individualistic. The United States has always been a very individualistic nation. It is one of the great strengths of the United States. But there are phases when it goes too far. And when every region starts looking out just for themselves and their tribes, and they think the entire system should work for them and their tribes. Toxic individualism is an unmitigated bad thing. And I say that with a lot of historical evidence. The periods we have gone through hyper-toxic individualism, they are always followed by a crisis. They happen about every 80 to 100 years. This is not my interpretation. It's a book about this called The Fourth Turning. And every 80 to 100 years, right before a major catastrophe or crisis, we go through a period of hyper and toxic individualism where we undo a lot of the institutions. We undo the power of institutions, especially the government. Happened before the American Revolution. It happened right before the Civil War. Happened in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression, World War II, and we are in the middle of a period of hyper and toxic individualism. So, unless history really doesn't, unless historical trends hold no ground, the toxic individualism we are in right now is going to lead to something bad. And we will talk about that next lecture with the Great Depression.